we are going to pick up where we leave off today and attempt to get to the Declaration of Independence. The reading for next time is just the next chapter in Wood, which is pretty straightforward. We will also read. So I want you to read the Declaration of Independence, and like I feel like I assign that everywhere. So like that's for many of you are like, oh, I got that. But no, now that you have an education and have some capacity to appreciate what's happening in the Declaration of Independence, actually read it and see what's going on, and that will be our primary text for the day. I want you to have a sense of the way that scholars usually interpret the Declaration, which is kind of as a political science document, like out of historical context. And so Richard Ellis is I almost said he's a fine historian. He's okay. he's not the best, but he's the sort of scholar that usually writes about the Declaration. And so I'm using him more as a foil than as this is what you need to think. Hopefully you'll have some tools from years of reading for yourself to kind of see what Ellis is getting right and what Ellis might be missing. So look for ways to jump in on that. Would a few of you like to share ideas for your research so that we can sort of get a sense of what everyone's working on? I know I've heard some good ideas. I'm excited about Jenna's topic. It's pretty good. You want to say something about it, or?
Yes. Okay, I'm doing Mercy Otis Watson, Warren.
Yeah, no, good.
And I kind of see her as like a feminist of her time, and she wrote the American Revolution story as it was happening, and she also wrote other political pieces.
Yeah, and she also does drama and literature. I mean, she's a sort of, to the extent that there's a Renaissance, she's a Renaissance woman. Yeah, it's good, very good. Other subjects of interest. Some of you are doing book reviews, and then Will's doing reviews. So at this point, I'm looking for you to tell me which books you think you want to write about. That way it doesn't get put off. Because if you try to write the last three, you'll be overwhelmed. The book review thing is manageable if you sort of do it. Like if you do one in February, you do one in March, and you do one in April, then it's not so bad. Yeah.
No, I've never written a research proposal in my life. I don't know why I got to the entire English major. We got that. But I threw some thoughts together. I'm not very narrowed down, but I'm into that article about Indian land and the that sparked interest in me. But I was fascinated just by the fact that it showed them the ones that's having agency in the conflict.
Yeah.
And so I want to explore that further. I'm not quite sure what
Okay.
direction, but I found some books that might be helpful.
Oh yeah. Good. And in particular, if you want to talk about this space doesn't connect super well to the American Revolution, but the question of the Seneca land on which the college now rests and its role in especially the War of 1812. I mean, that's a really interesting question, and there's stuff like around here. Other subjects that you might be interested in.
I'm looking at dueling.
Yes, that's great. Big, almost big. I mean, so that's a cultural history in which you're gonna have to choose representative moments, but that's a wonderful. It's a really focused topic of enormous kind of cultural significance. So that's a nice pairing. Same thing with Mercy Otis Warren. Marjorie?
I'm hearing how the founding of Alabama helped shape the democratic ideas of the Jacksonian era.
Why Alabama?
It was one of the ones that was being settled right around the time that Jackson was rising to power, so it kind of coincided with the time.
No, it's actually a terrific topic. I just wouldn't normally. Students don't usually say, "I want to write about Alabama." Are you from Alabama? Or
I'm not.
You're not at all. Okay.
I have a lot of literature on Alabama, so.
Yeah, no, it's actually it's a really good topic. That's wonderful. Yeah, Dylan?
I'm looking at the splitting of the national bank and the national capital, so moving the nation's capital to Washington DC and the bank staying in New York.
I like that a lot. Actually, that's a strategic decision with really long-term consequences for the US. It's good. It's good. Not everyone has to jump in, but yeah.
I was thinking about writing about the Whiskey Rebellion.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. You did that with your last, we talked about it. Your last paper was on Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania immigration and Quakers. And so what happens to all these Scots Irish people that the Quakers very deliberately say, other side of the Alleghenies. And there they are, and no, it's a great. Yeah, and you see, these are nice, these topics all sort of like, they're interesting to people. Like you would, an ordinary person would be curious about reading something about these, but they have a larger scope in that what you're really writing about isn't just the Whiskey Rebellion, it's about the fate of the Republic, right? Which is the subject of our course. Good. Other, David's got a good one. You don't need to be shy, it's good.
Yeah, I'm writing about, how like African American spiritual next phase.
Mhm.
I'm not sure where exactly.
That's okay, like that's, you, because it's an interesting subject, but because the source material is so fragmented and spread out, it's hard to say, well, I want to talk about the way that slaves sung in Macon County, Georgia. Like, no, that's, you're not going to get that. You're going to have to cast a broader net, but also really valuable, really interesting. Yeah.
American Revolutionary Espionage.
Okay. Secret Six kind of stuff.
Yeah,
or-
Culver's firing.
Okay, yeah, that's a fun paper. I get one of those every 4 years or so. You're gonna run into some source tricks,
Oh,
but it's a wonderful topic. There is enough there, but you're gonna have to work hard to get it all. Because it's, some of it's obscure, some of it's printed and stuff from 100 years ago, but it's a lot of fun. It's a good topic. All right. You are still figuring things out maybe, and that's all right. It's a good mix. It's a good mix. Okay. Here's what I'd like to do to start with. I want to build a timeline. The narrative here is overwhelming and everything happens at once. And it's hard, especially for historians who get really excited about kind of facts, to separate the facts from the story. There's so much data here that what I want you to try to do is to come up with 5 to 10 data points that we'll use to tell a story of what's happening in this decade. And you can choose different data points. And part of, if this works as an exercise, everyone will sort of look at their books and talk to each other and put together a little story. And then we can sort of map it onto the board and you'll see the larger kind of story. But what we're trying to figure out is how you move from like patriotic pride in England to resistance to revolution. How does it, that happens in the space of a decade. And so can you give some examples of that? You can talk to each other. You can consult your notes. I don't much care how you do this, but I'd like you to take about 10 minutes, maybe less. And try to put together your own sort of narrative as to what's happening here. And then we'll map it on the board and see if there are different narratives of this. But yeah, look at your notes, look at your books, talk to each other. 5 to 10 big things that you can fit on a card. And I'm going to use this as a quiz. So you'll turn it in at the end of class. And that way it'll be easy to grade, but I won't have to like.
You need like full sentences?
No.
Full-
Yeah, you could totally, you can use your books, you can talk to each other. I just want to see you kind of take a few minutes, put this together, and then we'll map it on the board. And I'm trying to do the same thing, and I'm actually finding it brutal. Like this is what my card looks like at the moment. I'm way over 10,
I don't think I can do that. We want 10.
up to 10.
Can I have like, how many fit in little money? How many taxes?
You could tell it as a tax story. If you think the revolution is about taxes, that's a way to organize it.
That's not it though.
And you could talk about,
Little money. There's not much.
well, that, I mean, yeah, you could say it's a specie crisis and then pick 4 or 5 things.
Yeah.
I'll add some things that you don't need. Yeah. And where's the? There was chalk when I started this class. Now it's like.
I mean, I've seen you, you have like this little.
Oh, it's like tiny. All right, we're gonna go on a military raid here. Hopefully I'll come back.
Why the planners were poor, why was everyone else poor? The Lakers poor, well, Lakers don't matter.
Breakers were not. for us.
Lakers don't matter.
Right.
They're out of the water. They don't protest.
They let us shut down, like,
I mean, it's not, they don't really lag. They just go.
Just the acts, but like-
Yeah.
we talked a lot about.
I mean, I'm not. I'm supposed to little money. And like, and there's like little bullet points, like, that's, I'm just gonna be bored.
Cool, that's what I'm doing, but I thought I.
A lot of people in most people in most of the world report that.
I'm just saying.
Massachusetts, it's the land issue, I talked about it. That's one of the big issues,
Yeah.
that there's a lot of people who expect to be all out there that they own. It's not that they're actually that work.
Well, that's what I mean, everything, you know, it's relative term for. Right, you just don't want any rocks around you.
I'm not big dates on that.
It's all kind of within like a few years. It's really, I mean,
Are you putting the people from?
I'm just trying to get things in my mind.
That's what I'm doing.
I don't
Makes me
know.
feel better.
I couldn't really manage in order, you know, so I don't remember.
I could have, I had serious thought.
You know, I mean, I could figure something out, but all the taxes, there's just a watch out.
Tax, like,
Like, yeah, names, I'm just like,
I remember some of the names.
it's this. It's kind of dead.
All right, give you one more minute. Revolution doesn't happen when you want it. It happens when the British show up.
Happens.
Okay, okay.
No, happens before.
And report, okay,
And your update, you need those two things together.
that's an accurate, well, that's an accurate description of
Report, update, but you know, whatever.
Western Pennsylvania, at least.
Well, yes.
All right, let me add a few things here and then we can.
What were the people in Pennsylvania doing? I noticed the book didn't really mention. Well, I guess it mentioned, Thomas.
The people in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, but they weren't.
Pennsylvania is complicated because the Germans and the Quakers aren't especially pro-revolution. They're like the most, you wouldn't call them Tories, but they're the most politically independent part of the colony.
Yeah, well.
So but the backcountry is ready, I mean, they're ready to shoot everybody. So they're Pennsylvania sort of torn in two. But then Dickinson, I mean, we read Dickinson's from Pennsylvania. So, yeah.
Curiously. When you say they're ready to fight everyone.
Yeah.
I think of them, are they following like this closely the political back and forth, or is it mostly just?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's kind of hotly contested. Scholars don't agree about that. Yeah, they're politically aware, but they're not following the nuances of the argument. Like what Dickinson writes about the authority to legislate, they don't care, right? But they do passionately not want to be told what to do, and they sort of, there's this leap that surprises everyone is no one expects people in Western Pennsylvania to care about British soldiers in Boston, but they do. Because they get angry because they recognize if that were happening to us, we would lose our minds. And so we ought to care about that. It's like that sort of unite or die kind of thing. The snake that sort of cut, like they get that. They're like, yeah, we have to care about these people because we know the British soldiers and they'll come for us. So it's a more existential idea than a constitutional theory, I think. Yeah. All right. Well, let's try to put this together. We're going to have different stories, and that's okay. I've put a story on the board that's a little bit more from a British point of view, and so it doesn't tell all of the facts. But part of what you need to process is that at the first half of this, there's a churning in power in England. You've got Prime Minister Grenville, the Rockingham government, under whom Townsend is Chancellor of the Treasurer. Townsend dies really suddenly in '68. And when he dies, like the Prime Minister, William Pitt, is actually at Bath, sort of vacationing. So Townsend was really in charge. Townsend is replaced by Lord North in '68, and Lord North is actually politically competent, unlike almost all of the people who came before him. And so there's a sort of transformation. The British policy vis-a-vis the colonies before '69 is a disaster. And it's not good policy, but it's coherent afterward. And so once you're trying to go, what are these decisive moments? Well, the British actually get better at pushing the Americans around. The North becomes prime minister, and that means it's harder to fight back. And so the Americans have a lot of success before the government forms. And then from 70 to 80, North is prime minister, and the colonists find it difficult to negotiate with the government because North is a British aristocrat who's incredibly sure of himself and sure of the king's support, and he doesn't feel like he needs us. That's a way to tell a story about the revolution from the British point of view. And we'll talk about specific policies here in a sec, but yeah.
And when you say like it was tougher to get England to back down.
Yes.
Okay, so they,
Yes.
not how they like
Yes.
operate.
There's also a shift. So this is sort of who's in power. They're hardcore Whigs. They're more Tories, and then was the original prime minister, and he's a definite Tory. Remember that there are like these 4 different factions in British politics. It's messy. You have actual Tories. You have country Whigs who were Jeffersonian, like Burke, who were pro-liberty. That's the Rockingham faction. You have court Whigs like Grenville and North, who are technically Whigs, and then you have radical Whigs like Pompey and John Wilkes, and they're not entirely relevant. So British politics does make sense, but it's complicated. All right, so I'm interested in some of you. How do we start the story? Like, what's happening at the beginning of this? We talked about kind of political forces and seismic habits of empire in our last class, but I want to actually kind of narrate the events. What's the revolution about? The story that you want to tell. Will's going to take a crack at this. Go for it.
Well, according to the book.
All right, let's get into it.
The authority of England to rule the colonies.
Okay.
Specifically, like the way they feel it though, it's through their economy,
Okay.
taxed.
Yes.
Internal.
Okay. Okay. So narrate that crisis for me from a authority to tax standpoint.
Okay, so you get the Stamp Act and by that's the internal tax. It's like specifically to
Good.
get revenue. So it's
Good.
really antagonistic. Like, they just want our money.
Yeah. Okay.
Then colonists do a bunch of anti-importation stuff. That's what you organize about that. So.
Okay.
It's not actually working.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
And the challenge of that. That's like.
Paper.
Yeah. Also, it really ends up working. Every action the British take ends up uniting the colonists.
Okay, good.
Build those great aspects of unity. Will we keep going or?
Well, you're at 1, 2, 3, 4. You got to give me at least 5. So,
Okay,
and then someone else can take over.
yeah. Thank you.
Well, go for it. Yeah.
Mostly before, like if there's the tobacco crash, the English don't have money for their army. There's a land problem in New England that wasn't mentioned in the book, that was last class,
That's right.
that exists. And Scots Irish want to move west, but can't. The Quakers are rich. But everyone else is real poor. And they're feeling it real hard.
Okay,
the
okay.
taxes.
Okay. So how do these poor people respond to the taxes?
Terrorism.
Okay, so this is a different account than what Wood gives us. Yeah.
Well, no,
So-
I mean, I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying that's what it is. I
Well,
don't,
but it's different. Yeah, this is good. Okay, so what sort of acts of terror do these rebel rousers use against the
well, they
British?
kill tax collectors every once in a while.
Killing, that's actually really harsh. That very rarely happens. Almost nobody dies, so it's no big
Okay.
deal. What do they do to the tax
They,
collectors?
they act like mobsters and,
Okay.
intimidate.
Yeah, there's a lot of intimidation. It's like, what can we, do you have a vivid story? They show up in Boston, they show up at the house of Oliver, who's the tax collector, and destroy his house. So there's a lot of personal destruction of personal property, but very rarely does a British official get killed. So this is very different than the French
They
Revolution,
think that shit. too.
right? Yeah. Yeah, Oliver's house is destroyed. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house is attacked. Yeah.
I've never understood, so should we be thinking of them as like decisions that people make, we are going to do this, or is it more just like the mob gets?
Think about it like this. It all depends on what you think the American Revolution is, right? So there's a Republican argument that's going to say, smaller Republican, this is about union, this is about liberty, this is about constitutional theory. This is Adams and Franklin and Dickinson. And then what does Lenin say about revolution? Lenin says that revolutions are festivals of the oppressed, right? So if that's what a revolution is, you're going to tell a really different story And what really matters is like so, and this is, there's a
Why
sort of,
can't those things coexist?
They do.
They do.
they do. But if you try to tell all of the story at once, it gets overwhelming. So historians with different emphases want to say this is what changed things. This is what persuaded the British. And it's complicated because there's this sort of back and forth in American colonies between kind of, they wouldn't necessarily elites, although your argument would say they're elites, but between the poor and the haves, between the Hancocks and the Morrises and the Henrys and that, right? There's also this sort of back and forth up here. And so you've got the discussion over the colonies it's a transatlantic sort of debate between the Tories and the Whigs and between and well, let's move forward because it's messy, but okay. In this story, what else do the people do to sort of respond? Right, so somewhere in between political organizing and acts of terrorism, you've got boycott and home manufacture. So this is the space that women's historians have gotten really excited about. Like in my class last term, my American survey class, we read a book by Carol Birkin on Republican women who maybe drive the revolution forward, because if you don't want to import British goods, you can make a lot of them at home. Okay. What else? Let's move forward from this. So what happens to the argument for revolution from where we kind of left off last time, which is the Townsend crisis? Like somebody's got a card that talks about what happens between 68 and
Well, in 70, we get the Boston Massacre.
all right. Where do I put that? That's down here. Is that
It's a protest. It was.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little,
Terrorism. You know, yeah.
depends on your point of view?
They were harassing soldiers.
Okay, but keep going. This is good.
and then I also had in 73, we get the Tea Act.
Okay.
And then like the colonists' response to the Tea Act, which we get the Boston Tea Party.
Okay. How does the British government respond to the Boston Tea Party?
Poorly.
Yeah.
They sent more soldiers to them.
Okay. The soldiers actually show up at multiple points.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They don't, so I think the British can't afford to keep soldiers on the frontier, so they
Right.
consolidate them to the coastal cities to like, the book says to economize.
Yeah. Okay.
But
This
the
is true. This is
colonists
true.
Take it as.
Okay. When does that happen? Do we have a sense of that?
68.
Right. So there are these moments, like you put, I think, 10,000 soldiers in Boston there, but in 60, where is it? Like here, they send, there are 2 regiments. They're consolidated, and the thought is that they're actually going to put them in New York, which is more centrally located and more pro-military than Boston is. Yeah. And so like it's not all about taxes. Right? So you can have a constitutional objection to taxes, but when they garrison the troops, what's your constitutional objection to that? Because that's something that's always happened. There's no, maybe there is a precedent objection. We could sort of get at what makes the garrisoning constitutionally messy. The mob doesn't care, but John Adams is like, oh, you can't do that. That's a violation.
It's just a post hoc rationalization that he doesn't want the troops there, like.
Okay, well, that's what maybe Patrick Henry would say, but John Adams actually has a constitutional theory.
It's that they're quartering people's homes.
Yeah.
as opposed to barracks.
So here we're gonna have both sides have sort of actions and theory that are unfolding. And so the coercive acts, there are 4 acts, and then there's a 5th sort of act that happens at the same time. And yeah, one of the acts is a quartering act that basically allows the governor to seize the appropriate people's private houses and food stocks. And so you would have it. It would be like as if, yeah, Joe Biden sent in the airborne troops and everyone's floor had 4 soldiers on it. And you were gonna pay for them out of your tuition and the cafeteria, they could eat in the cafeteria for free. So we're all bearing the price of that. And yeah, Joe Biden would get really popular all of a sudden. Okay. So yeah, there's this back and forth. This is already starting to get a little messy. Let's fill it in a little bit more. So, go ahead.
I can't remember exactly what this happened. One of the more interesting things for me was this idea of representation being
Yes.
different.
Okay.
So they're in the colonies, they're starting to get a more practical, more what we have now. Representation is more based on your geographic area, your population, you can actually vote, and then.
Yes. Okay.
But Britain is still holding on to this idea, you're represented, they represent all of you, when in fact they're representing parts of the
Right.
country that don't even have anybody.
Good. Yeah. So this is one of the ways we respond to the Stamp Act. Is this is a direct taxation on the Americans without any representation in Parliament, and so the objection is made. You don't have the authority to tax us like that because we're not represented in Parliament. And we don't have actual you should only be taxed by your actual representatives. And the Brits actually seem to hear that because in the next round of taxation, the Earl of Townsend says, it's actually what he does is there's a certain amount of sleight of hand in it. He's politically capable and strategically really flawed. So what he does to secure, he's a new chancellor, what he does to secure his influence in Parliament is he walks in and tells Parliament that he's going to propose let me get the number right. It's something terrific. A £400,000 cut on land taxes, which is primarily how the upper middle class is taxed in England. So Parliament responds to that with raucous cheers. And members of the opposition sort of meekly raise their hands and say, okay, how are we going to pay for this? Like, you're cutting taxes in the face of this massive debt. And they're shouted down. So that the tax cut gets passed. And then Townsend's like, well, okay, now we're facing this really real financial pressure. We've got to do something. And so what I propose is a reform of imperial taxation everywhere. And the opposition's really angry about this. They don't support it, but like British electors are actually still more likely to tax the empire as a whole than private land. And so it's a shifting of the taxing burden out into the empire, and the Parliament loves it.
This may not be the best question,
Yeah, it's great questions.
but I've seen before people say essentially, well, why didn't Parliament just grant like 13 spots to colonists?
Okay,
So, because that would essentially blow
Right.
up this whole argument,
right.
and it wouldn't, like, Parliament could still like easily overrun them,
Okay,
and I don't really have a good answer.
it's a good question. It's a good
I don't have
question.
an answer for it.
But the thing is, if they did that, they would have to overhaul their entire system of representation at home,
This is it.
which they don't want to do yet, because that would involve granting votes to a bunch of people who they don't want.
Yeah. When do they finally get around to this?
I don't remember, but it's a lot later.
1830s.
Yeah, 1832, 1867, 1910. Yeah, it takes them almost a century of slow, liberal, piecemeal electoral reform. By the 20th century, Britain is democratic, whereas like Alabama's democratic, like day one. Yeah, so this is a big shift. Yeah, it might have prevented the American Revolution, but it would have required the kind of political change. It would require them to behave as if the French Revolution had already happened, and it hasn't. So that's hard. Yeah.
And should we think that the colonists knew that they wouldn't like?
That's an interesting question. Do the colonists that you're reading seem to be sensitive to political calculation?
Yes, so no.
Right. There are people who seem to really be savvy about how to move forward. Adams is really politically good at this. He's terrible at making speeches. Everyone wants him to shut up. He talks for a long time and no one wants to hear him, but he's actually politically cunning at knowing what Britain's going to do. But Adams doesn't want a reconciliation. Adams wants to go all in on independence, right? Yeah, my sense is that the Americans think they're right. I mean, we think about those Washington letters I had you read. Washington isn't so much worried about like, how are we politically going to do this? They feel like the little guy, and they need, it would be like students are really angry about a certain set of gen ed requirements. And like, are they sensitive to the politics of the academic council and the way that a set of like 5 or 6 elected faculty members are going to set the gen ed curriculum? Students might be really angry, but we made you take 4 math classes. We think that's a good idea. Students would be up in arms, right? And then, but like, would they have a sense of how actually things get done? I'm not sure. A few people might, right? Okay, I want you to also have a sense that this isn't just about taxes, because it is about taxes, but there's a parallel kind of course. So if you were not saying it's about poverty and wealth, but it's about the authority to not just tax, but the authority to legislate. Townsend also creates a set of admiralty courts. Admiralty courts are where you try piracy cases. And he wants them set up for the colonies. There's one going to be in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Funny, why not put it in New York City? No, we're going to put it in Nova Scotia because that's essentially a military colony. It's very pro-king. So what happens when you create, not only create these tax laws, but create a set of courts that are going to administer the tax laws. We said this last time, where the revenue from the tax laws is going to fund the collection. This is actually an intelligent imperial reform designed to actually make the empire work. And it's well-written legislation. It's politically, but like bureaucratically, it's really quite nice. So all of these things sort of work together. And what then happens is the collectors recognize their financial incentives and begin to enforce things. So they seize one of John Hancock's ships, a ship named the Liberty. Curiously named. And they find on board 3,000 pounds worth of smuggled wine from Iberia. It's not supposed to be there, right? And so they fine him 54,000 pounds. And it seems to be like, it seems like he actually was breaking the law. But the problem is that the customs collector royally screws the case up in terms of procedure. There's only one witness to the seizure. And the arresting officer seems to have been like mind-blowingly drunk when he makes the arrest. And so his question is Hancock is able to get this dismissed on a technicality. And yet people are really concerned about the precedent. So there's like, appreciate this on multiple levels. There's constitutional arguments about taxation. But beyond that, it seems like the British are actually seizing power in non-tax areas. And then Americans, it seems like, aren't always responding out of principle. Sometimes they're responding with like, yeah. Go ahead.
Could he have paid that?
54,000?
Yeah, I don't know how.
It would have ruined, well, I mean, yes, but it would have destroyed it.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. If I were faced with a $100,000 tax bill today, I could pay it, but it would wreck my retirement. I mean, that would be a financially devastating thing for me. This 54,000 is massive. Yeah. How do the colonists respond to the Townsend duties? I mean, so there's on the one hand, there's the boycotts. Well, actually, this is a blank here. All we have is the Boston Massacre, and the Boston Massacre is later. So there's a set of boycotts that actually work. The British economy suffers a 700,000 pound trade deficit in response because nobody buys anything and nobody pays these taxes. And so the customs collectors aren't being paid. Like it doesn't work. Townsend dies and he's replaced by North first as chancellor and then North as prime minister. And then British government gets competent from about this point forward. But what, like, did the colonists develop any constitutional objections to this? Or is it now all about power? Yeah,
Well, you also get the letters from the farmers in
Good.
Pennsylvania.
yeah.
So
good, good.
it's less of like an actual action, and now it's like this almost philosophical
Yeah.
thought that there's now trading between the colonists.
Good. Yeah, so Dickinson, this is where things get slippery, is Dickinson developed a different argument than the one that Ben Franklin just deployed against the Stamp Act. And so the Brits are starting to feel like they're getting dizzy because, well, we did what you wanted, and now you're raising new constitutional objections. You're being disingenuous. You're not, but Dickinson's objections seem to be fairly principled. So what are his objections? This is subtle, but if you read that second letter, or you looked at it, he lays it out very clearly. And Dickinson writes the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. Yeah?
So he's against both internal and external,
Yeah.
taxing, right?
Yeah, so he wants to say, yeah, this is actually kind of a red herring. Like, I'm not, he's like, yes, I would like actual representation, but even if we had actual representation, this isn't legitimate. Like, we've gone beyond this. And the question is why? This is where he makes a conservative constitutional argument about precedent. He says the British government in hundreds of years has never passed a bill like the Townshend Duties. I'm not sure if he's right, but you have to wrestle with that claim to see it. Okay, he says this is unique. The Parliament's trying to do something new. There has been trade legislation for hundreds of years. And the purpose of trade legislation has always been to kind of force people to buy English. You don't want Americans to buy French and Spanish and German manufacturing. Like, we want to help the whole. So Americans help the home country by buying. And the way that you enforce that is you impose prohibitory taxes. It would be like, if the equivalent would be, what if we decided that we wanted people to buy American cars, and so we would put $100,000 tax on any foreign car. But it's functionally like that. Can you still buy a foreign car if you want to? If you're really rich and you're LeBron James and you want to drive a Lamborghini, yep, sure you can. You're just going to pay for it. So that's what this is. This is what Dickinson's argument is. And what's happened now? The Sugar Act cuts taxes by 50%. So now these taxes aren't necessarily like prohibitive. It's a different. It's like, what if Congress taxes Japanese cars at $5,000 a car? What's the purpose of that taxation? Yes, I don't know if everyone heard that. Like, Dickinson's argument is this is a revenue measure. They're taxing us for revenue, not for regulation. Parliament absolutely does have the authority to regulate trade in the empire for the good of the empire, especially in times of war. Like, yes, God save the king, but this isn't any different than what they did to us before. They're stipulating that we need paper, right? We have to buy British paper, and you're going to tax us. And you can set, and this is where it's not so much about what the tax level is, it's just the theory. You could tax paper at $1,000 a sheet. Is there any reason why Parliament couldn't do that? No. And you would have to buy it. And he says that's unconstitutional because it's never been done before. And in the British system, precedent is less about like whether or not constitutionality isn't determined by whether or not there's a constitutional amendment. That doesn't exist. It's has it been done before? And the debates on this get really intense. But again, in this moment, the Whigs, the country Whigs say, but the Americans are right. Like when Charles I tried to do this to us, we called it like tyranny, and we put him on trial. So like this, at this point in time, the British opposition is with. And so these get repealed. Largely, it's because of this. But there's one moment in here where the Brits, if you're telling a constitutional story, there's one important thing that gets mentioned. It's forgotten, right? Declaratory Act. What's the Declaratory Act?
If I remember correctly, it's Parliament repeals one of their other ones.
I think it's the Towns and Duties. It could be the Stamp Act. I'm a little, it's okay. So yeah, the Declaratory Act is actually, I'm wrong. It's here. It's not, it's in 66, not in 67, right?
Yeah, that repeals the Stamp Act.
Right, good. But what does the Declaratory Act say? Yeah,
It's essentially Parliament saying, all right, you won this one, but we're gonna win the war, we have the ability.
okay. Yeah, no, it does declare this declaration of will, but what does it say? Parliament basically says, okay, in matters of taxation, we say uncle.
Yeah.
We don't have the ability to do this. But there's a deeper fight that we're not going to give up, and it's where Parliament says that they have the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Right? And they have to be sensitive on the taxation issue because of the precedent in English history. But on all these other issues, they're not going to give, which makes all these other cases actually really important. Like when I teach this to my survey class, to the freshmen, I generally gloss over this because it's really complicated. But there are these deeper issues, like the Admiralty courts. Like you're an American, you think you're an English citizen. English citizens aren't. This isn't just about taxation. You're entitled to rights that date back to Magna Carta, right? So if you get accused of a crime, you have the right to be tried in a court by a jury of your peers. And now the British government is saying that it has the right to bind you in all cases whatsoever. And these customs cases are going to be tried in piracy court. You might be tried as a pirate under martial law. Like that doesn't seem like it's just about taxes. That seems like it's, yeah. Add to that the radical Whig sort of suspicion that there's a conspiracy to take away your liberties. And like, yeah, people get really paranoid. It's not just that they're against Admiralty jurisdiction. It's like, what's next? They're going to come for us next. Like, somebody has a plot. And in British politics, you're never going to actually attack the king. Even if you know wrong, it's always the king's ministers. And so these really hateful kind of critiques develop of the prime minister. Yeah.
In the declaration, is that, does it say the colonies, meaning all colonies? Or
Yeah.
is it- Okay.
All colonies.
But
There are.
it's aimed at these.
It's more than that. I mean, so remember, there are 22 colonies, not 13, in British North America. And the most lucrative colonies are where? Yeah, Britain's not going to give them up. They're deeply tied to London. They're not remotely interested in independence. So yeah, British policy is designed for them as much as for the other colonies. There's a large population that's building in the northern colonies. You could tax them and get revenue from them. But traditionally speaking, the wealth of the empire is rooted in something like the Caribbean colonies. But there are also Canadian maritime colonies, which are really new and largely military colonies and not remotely interested in independence.
But does this also apply to India?
Not so much because India is complicated. This is where we should talk about. Yeah, East India Company is a right. But it's essentially like, how do I say this? It's like Tesla gone wrong. Right? We give Tesla massive tax breaks to develop this technology that we want. And if Tesla started losing money and was very well connected to Congress, we could pass one of these laws, except instead of it being a law to protect British, like American cars, what if we passed the tax on all gasoline vehicles to the tune of $50,000? That's going to be really good for Tesla. Oh, and the only people who can sell electric cars are Tesla. And now we have the T-Act. And again, the British Parliament is like playing favorites in this really massive way. But this is an age before we have sort of liberal conception of free trade that are dominant politically. You've got Adam Smith is around, he's writing, but Parliament doesn't operate by his rules yet. So they're still mercantilists. Okay. One of the hardest periods to understand in American political history, in the history of the revolution, is the space between 1769 and 1773. So what happens in there? Does anyone have anything on their little cards that tell the story of that? Yeah.
When you said that Lord North comes to power and the British opposite,
Yeah.
and the book said that there was a sort of uneasy
Correct. Correct.
pause too much.
Well, it's there was nothing so much to object to. The British were being careful. The Boston Massacre happens. That could have been a revolution. What happened? What's the story after the Boston Massacre? Does anyone know? British officers opened fire on this crowd of essentially teenagers throwing snowballs. And 5 teenagers get killed. One of them's black. And the British officers are, the Admiralty courts only apply to customs cases. So the British officers are then tried by the Massachusetts government for murder in front of a jury. And the officers, in a fit of like forensic brilliance, hire John Adams to defend them. And John Adams is brilliant on defense. And he persuades the Boston jury that the officers were just doing their jobs and they're acquitted. So that actually looks like, that could have been bad, but it actually looks like the system is working. And there is the rule of law. And if the jury had wanted to convict, they could have. So then there's a case. There's another event with the Gaspee, this British customs ship, like a Coast Guard ship that gets attacked and burned. But these are like, they're small things. There's silence. And then the Tea Act. We already talked about the Tea Act, right? It's the monopoly to the East India Company. What happens to the tax levels? I'm not sure if you caught that. How much does this raise taxes on tea? If you're a Star Wars fan, there's Admiral Akbar saying, it's a trap, it's a trap. Yeah, it's actually a really dramatic tax cut. I think they cut it from 3 pence on the pound to 1 penny on the pound. And so this is designed to actually get Americans to buy a lot of tea. And they're going to dump this tea on American markets, and there's going to be lots of cheap tea. But the reason they want to do this, like they're doing it for political reasons. They should have never gone near this. We could have avoided an American Revolution for a while, perhaps, if they had noticed. But the reason they're doing it is essentially British corruption. Somebody owes a favor to somebody in the EIC, and they're going to do it. But here's the thing: like, the Declaratory Act is over here. And what you have at the end of the Townsend duties is the repeal, but then not on tea. So Americans between 69 and 73 are fully engaged in the empire again, and they're buying glass, and they're buying paper, and they're buying everything they want. They're spending themselves willy-nilly trying to outdo their neighbors about how rich they are and how they have all the ways good. Except nobody's buying tea. Because the tea is still subject to taxation. And in the American mind, they've read Dickinson and they're like, if we pay this tax on tea, then we're accepting the precedent. And then they'll get us later. So it's unpatriotic to buy tea. This is when Americans start getting interested in coffee or like other kinds of strange things that they can drink, right? And so this to Americans, this doesn't just look like a stupid act of crony monopolism. It looks like, oh, now they're going to make us. Yeah.
So how important was that document, the votes and the proceedings that the Bostonians published? Where they start talking about it basically lists out all of these British violations of American rights. Because that comes in 72, so that's in that kind of
That's good.
period.
What happens in this time space is actually really crucial, is you build this local level political organization. So yeah, like in my constitutional story, like there's relative silence, but in Isaiah's story, the people are poor and oppressed, like they get really organized, and they're paranoid that the British are about to do something.
Are they still poor?
Maybe not in Massachusetts, but the sort of like but you have all of these, like to go with your argument, like in Massachusetts, there's no more land, right? So you have all of these people in their 20s and early 30s who can't afford to get married. They don't have land, they don't have farms. They move to Boston. They're working as laborers or artisans. This is like Paul Revere's Sons of Liberty group. You could say that they're kind of like a rent-a-mob. Like when you want the Sons of Liberty to fire up, you show up with a couple of kegs of rum and some pamphlets and you give a couple of rousing speeches and they'll go off and do whatever. Then this is Boston, nobody's gonna kill anybody. But they'd be happy to tar and feather a tax collector if they're a little bored, right? So there's a sense in which that's really starting to build, that the towns are organizing, it becomes acceptable to say these things. And there's a sense with thousands of British soldiers in Boston, the Brits have no control over Boston. They have no control over the countryside except in Boston. That makes sense. This isn't as true in New York. And in Pennsylvania, like the Quakers were like, well, we're pacifists, we're gonna be loyal. The other space where you get this restlessness is if you read Washington's correspondence, you get the sense that he's really angry. And he hasn't forgotten. And he's also really angry that he had all this land in West Virginia that he can't use. And so there are these deep resentments that haven't been forgotten. Then you get the Tea Act. And the response to the Tea Act isn't actually this high-level constitutional theory. It's the Tea Party, right? What was the Tea Party? Throw all the tea in the harbor, yeah?
Basically, when people got had enough of the tea, I think, or did the East India Tea Company ship
Yeah.
that the Native Americans?
The Dartmouth. Yeah, right.
Do the crazy tea into the harbor.
Yeah, why would you dress up as natives? That's a really interesting move. Like a political rhetoric. Yeah,
It's maybe a way of saying you can't control us.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's some interesting assumptions.
There is a lot of
made
interesting
there,
assumptions there.
But based on their society at the time, it's this group that people are afraid of. They
Right,
don't really understand.
right,
That have tactics that they don't know how to fight.
right.
So that works really well as
Okay,
a disguise, but also symbolism. You can't control us.
yes, yes, yes. So there's a sort of sense like it's a strange move. They feel like the British are treating them like John Adams writes this anonymous piece in which he signs it Humphrey Plowdriver as if he's a common ordinary farmer. But the famous line from Humphrey Plowdriver's essay from this period is, "We won't be their Negroes. You're treating us like slaves. We won't do this." But then they dress up as natives because natives, whatever they are, they're poor, but they're not slaves. And they're seen as being virtuous and un-British. So it's a sort of declaration of independence in a way. It's also set up, like this back to Zeb's question, like, well, how closely are the common people tracking constitutional theory? It's a really interesting, the day that it happens, the night that it happens is the night before Hutchinson has decreed that the cargo will be seized and the cargo is sold for payment of tax. Because Hutchinson has been given the exclusive right to collect the tax, and he is losing his shirt over this, and he's the lieutenant governor. So tomorrow, the ship is going to be seized, that this tax is going to be paid, and so then Britain can say, oh, we have precedent. And to prevent that from happening, like the Tea Party, like the way it happens is thoroughly populist, but the timing of it really is connected. Somebody in the Sons of Liberty is paying attention to the law, probably Paul Revere. Yeah. Okay, and then we get the response, which is Britain. How does Britain react? This is new. Yeah.
They shut down the harbor of Boston until they repay it.
Okay. How much damages are we talking about? 10,000 pounds, which do you have a sense of how that translates into today's money?
No.
Oh, no. We're talking like a couple million. So 10,000 is not impossible. Like Boston could pay that. It would hurt because this is a city that's twice the size of Wellsville. Like, could Wellsville raise $10 million? It would be hard, but they could. But that's not the point, right? That's like that. That's not right. What else? This is the point where George Washington enters our story, because Washington is writing to Lord Fairfax at this point. So Washington emerges as a political actor in Virginia. Like he's been radio silent, like you could read his letters. And I've read large chunks of Washington's letters. And he's really interesting, but he's primarily just a struggling farmer and he's dealing with the tobacco crisis and he's complaining about his Western land. But Washington doesn't emerge as an intensely political figure until this moment. And suddenly he is fired up, angry about stuff that's happening in Boston. And again, that's a kind of surprise. The colonists conceive of themselves as a whole. And people living in Western Pennsylvania, people living in Virginia see themselves as having something in common with this other colony that they've never been to. And like Washington, no doubt, knows people who have been to Boston, but they're like, people, these are the sons of Puritans. They're like funny, they're culturally different. People who live in Virginia think they have more in common with English aristocrats than they do with Bostonians. And yet, Washington is motivated. What else do they do? Yeah, go ahead.
At some point, we're British, start sending in more troops.
Okay, so this is the second quartering act. Is that unconstitutional? Well, from the American point of view, it's wildly unconstitutional, yes, now, because we're not talking about taxation anymore. We're talking about the rights of Englishmen. We're talking about like Magna Carta stuff. And this has gotten existential. And so if this is about the authority to tax, and this is about the authority to, let me look at my notes here, to legislate, to regulate, this is about the authority to regulate. If they can do that, they can do anything. Because here's the thing, that would not fly in England. Like that's the very definition of tyranny. A standing army in times of peace occupying. What if you occupied Boston in East Anglia? No. I mean, George III wouldn't do it, is the point. But when Charles I did stuff like that, it was what triggered the Civil War. So from an American point of view, that's all true. Two or three other things you kind of have. There's the Massachusetts Charter Act, in which Parliament suspends the government of Massachusetts. That's, again, from a Massachusetts person's point of view, the charter is your constitution. It's your written constitution. It protects your rights and liberties, and it guarantees your rights as English people. And this is a technical term, but this is when Americans really begin to say, we've got nothing to do with Parliament. They argue that our charter is a contract between us and the king. Just like in Canada today, they still sing God Save the Queen, but they don't think they have anything to do with Parliament. So they're developing, Americans by 74 start developing a Commonwealth theory of empire, where they still owe a lot to George III, but not to Parliament. And if Parliament could suspend your charter, then Parliament is tyrannical. This is a bit technical, but how do you think the English opposition reacts to that? William, well, Pitt is dead, but Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke's going to say no, that's not right. Because from a British, this is where the differences between the Brits and the Americans become out. From a British point of view, Parliament is the guarantor of liberty, right? So they would say, and you sort of get this dueling, a battle of two constitutions. The Massachusetts folk are defending their charter, which is pre-English Civil War, with this list of liberties that no one in the king can't touch. But the English people of the 18th century would say, well, where do we have our liberties anyway? We got them from Parliament. It's like they would cite the Declaration of Right in 1689 and from the Glorious Revolution, and they'd be like, no, the English people are in charge. We really are. So you can't say Parliament can't do that, because that's exactly the way England runs. England is a parliamentary government. And so what to Americans seems like a fine point in constitutional theory, to the English people finally seemed like anarchy. So this debate actually becomes really crucial, because up until this point, the American struggle for rights was a battle that was also an English struggle, right? And there were are two great sides. It'd be like if the Republicans and Democrats were fighting like cats and dogs about something related to Puerto Rico. And then all of a sudden, the Republicans and Democrats, who hate each other's guts, suddenly agreed and said, yeah, you know what? You can't, that doesn't fly. And so Britain actually unites against the colonists. And that makes this, what happens even, yeah. And part of it's because North is really good. Two more things. Administration of Justice Act. Washington talked about this. He had a special name for this act. He called it the Murder Act. What is that? What does this allow?
Yeah, so military rule?
Yeah,
Yeah, so they all get, they get tried military courts. So
yeah, yeah.
If you're functional, if you're
Yeah.
not, if you're an officer, you just do whatever.
There's no chart, there's no economic activity in the port. The charter has been suspended. There are now troops. And what if there's another Boston Massacre? Well, those officers are going to be tried in a military court in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the pirate stick, right? And basically, yeah, they're never going to get acquitted. I mean, they're never going to get convicted. In the same way, imagine in Iraq 6 or 7 years ago, right? Imagine American officers being tried by Iraqi civilians. There's just no way the US government would ever set that up. Like Americans who commit crimes in Iraq are tried, and I think they were tried reasonably fairly, and there was due process, but yeah, but from the colonist point of view, George Washington calls it the Murder Act because he says, yeah, like this looks like a conspiracy, right? And then there's an unrelated act with a really unfortunate timetable. And Washington sort of closes one of his letters to his friend Fairfax, basically saying, he's now fighting with his best friend. Like they're just going at each other. This guy he grew up with in Virginia. Well, Fairfax is a clergyman. He later becomes Lord Fairfax. He's the first American-born person to get an English peerage. He's a really interesting guy. Fairfax, his grandfather or great-grandfather had been the second son of a Scottish lord. And so the first son inherits the title in Scotland, and the second son comes over to America and becomes a tobacco planter, right? Really familiar Virginia story. But what happens in the 1780s is the Scottish family dies out. And the heir to the Scottish seat is actually an American-born Virginia farmer. And Fairfax really likes this. And so he actually, this is after the American Revolution. He has to go to London and fight to get recognized. And yeah, they move back to Scotland and become peers. And this is one of George Washington's best friends. And like Washington is really pro-revolution. Fairfax is an interesting guy. He feels stuck in the middle. He thinks that all of these pieces of legislation are unconstitutional. But he objects violently to with what you're characterizing as terrorism. But he actually thinks this is all politically unwise. That the best thing that ought to be done, and this is where kind of the American government moves in this stage, is to petition the king humbly for a redress of grievances. And between 73 and 76, they do this over and over and over and over and over again. Because the moderates really want it. This is the Pennsylvania response. The Quakers are like, well, yeah, this is wrong. They can't treat us this way, but it's not like we're going to fight a war. Like, let's ask them nicely and they'll stop. And if they would have done that in the chaos of the 60s, they would have found someone who wanted to help them. But like at this point in time, North is in control. He's got a government, and he has his own agenda, which we'll talk about next time. Yeah. So the next, at the end of one of these letters to Fairfax, Washington just sort of coyly asks, "Have you read the Canada Bill?" And this for lots of folks is sort of like the icing on the cake. We talked about this a little bit last time. What does the Canada Bill do? Yeah.
With like the capitalism of back and it grants people to back like religious freedom.
Yes. Yeah. People in Quebec now get to be Catholic. They also, even more horrifying to Americans, don't get English common law. Now, this is a benevolent act from the point of view of the colonial ministry. These people are French. They want French law, so give them French civil law. It's what they've had for hundreds of years. But by combining Ohio and West Virginia into Quebec, Washington owns chunks of that land, remember, right? And then transferring that land under French civil law, the government has basically made Washington's land like useless, because like what Virginian in their right mind is going to move into the space with French Catholicism and French civil law? And so that to Washington looks like this massive conspiracy. Okay. One other thing happens. I want to tell you a story before I run out of time. This happens on September 5th, 1774. It's the day that the British destroyed Boston. Have you heard the story? General Gage has this army, I think now of 5,000 men in Boston. And he sends 260 regulars out to seize some gunpowder on the other side of the river in Cambridge, where they have some cannons that the militia have been using. It sounds a heck of a lot like Lexington and Concord, right? Rumor spreads across the Massachusetts countryside that 6 patriotic Cambridge men have been killed in resisting this raid. And so what happens? Hundreds of Massachusetts militiamen swarm into Cambridge. They actually bring sticks, not guns, because they don't have their guns available. But the militias muster and they move unarmed into Cambridge, right? That says something about how intense they are. And they discover that actually, like, it's a lie. Boston's fine. It was just a rumor. But the rumor spreads faster than the word of what happened can catch up. So within 48 hours, all of rural New England has been told that the British have destroyed Boston. And so like in Eastern Connecticut, militias muster, get their guns, and march armed toward Boston. Like they're ready to go. And this is like, nothing has happened. This is 1774. They rally, according to Ezra Stiles, who was a prominent pastor from Eastern Connecticut, 20,000 Connecticut guys grab their guns and march. And like, they get into central Massachusetts and everyone's like, oh no, that was just a rumor. And they turn around and go home. It's like, does this really matter? Yes and no. I mean, nothing actually happened on paper, but you guys are like, oh no, this matters. Like, why does it matter? Why is this important? Yeah.
It shows that they're like acting as.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a sort of unwitting test run. It actually tells the militiamen that we are more ready to do this than we thought we were, because most of those men who grabbed their guns and started marching thought that they were probably just stupidly going to face this impossible thing, right? It's like us in our little town against the British Army. But that sort of brings this collective awareness of like, oh no, we're all ready to go. And Massachusetts, like, so in 1775, then in April, when the British do something similar and they launch a raid on Lexington and Concord, like they get a really different response. And the Brits don't quite understand what this meant in a way that America, the Sons of Liberty, understood what this meant. So that's that date, that in the fall of 74, things are actually turning decisively against the British, and they're not fully aware of it. I've heard estimates of 50,000 militiamen. That seems like a lot, and like understand that this is a militia, not a professional army. It's like they're not going to stay. That's not a group of people who are going to put Boston under siege, but it's a group of people who would show up to fight a pitched battle in defense of their homes and then go home. Right? Like, this is not a professional army, but it's a signal that things have really changed. And you've got that. The militias are rallying. But you also have this continuance of petition. Like into 75, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson is still writing these petitions to the king. All right, so that takes us to this kind of crisis point in 75. Next time we'll talk about the British decision to keep escalating the conflict. We'll talk about the American debate between independence and kind of moderation. And then we'll talk about the actual declaration. That's our goal for next time. And then I've got some stuff, we haven't talked much about loyalism, but next week I've got this great little unit on loyalism that I know you're gonna get angry at. Yeah, turning your little cards. I can give you some points. Yeah, put your name on your card, that would be great.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and your proposals too, that would be great.
How many points do we need?